In Australia, our culture and the way we see gender
has been pretty influenced by British colonisation
and the values that came with it.
We've started to see more trans people than ever being visible and advocating for our equality.
But the idea of gender beyond the binary is actually not a very new concept.
It's existed in different places throughout the world for thousands of years.
The way that gender is viewed and expressed varies a lot between cultures.
and the experiences of gender diverse people can be pretty different when you're also a person of colour.
Arguments are sometimes made that transness and gender diversity are new concepts.
That have been invented by Western society.
Not only is this a tool often used to discredit and silence gender diverse people of colour,
But it's simply not true.
There's a few layers to unpack here.
Even if it was a white people thing, so what?
Why can't we be gender diverse too?
It's kind of racist to imply that we can't because we're not white.
And on top of that, there's actually a long history of gender diversity.
That goes back hundreds of years outside of a Western context.
For example, in North America, there's a long history of two-spirit people among Native Americans.
Who feel like they embody aspects of a masculine and a feminine spirit.
Or different balances of masculine and feminine characteristics.
And here in Australia, a good example of this is brother boys and sister girls. Brother boys and sister girls have existed in Indigenous Australia for thousands of years, before Western cultures invaded Australia, proving that trans is not a current cultural phase, but has existed for many thousands of years, including within the oldest culture the world has to offer, Aboriginal Australia. Originally, Indigenous people believed that sometimes people could be born as male, who was then assigned the body of a female, and vice versa. However, as communities became closer tied, knowledge expanded and the meaning became ever-changing, and continuously evolved to our current definition, a definition that we see today as trans. Brother boy and sister girl is now lovingly used within communities of trans Indigenous people, as well as communities surrounding them. Language within Indigenous cultures has changed, but the casual nature in which brother boys and sister girls are mentioned remains the same. The variation of the terms brother boy and sister girl changes from tribe to tribe or group to group, but essentially, most Indigenous tribes and groups have a term for trans people. Trans people and brother boys and sister girls will always have a place within the Indigenous community. There's lots of history of gender diversity outside of Australia too, where before the arrival of colonising cultures, there are examples of all different kinds of gender diversity.
I was born in Vietnam, and in mainstream Indigenous Vietnamese culture, there's a religion called Đạo Mẫu, which has been around since before Buddhism was introduced to Vietnam, over 2,500 years ago. Within this religion, there's a spiritual person called Đồng Cô. Typically, this person is assigned male at birth. Some people say that this is similar to being gay, whereas others would say that it's similar to being trans. They've lived in temples, performing ceremonies for celebrations and blessings. They were very well respected in the past and are still very well respected by people who are Đạo Mẫu followers in modern Vietnam. So gender diversity isn't just a new Western thing after all.
What is very Western is the way that some people approach or describe gender diversity.
A lot of the language we've developed as a community has happened in response to very Western and very binary ideas about what gender should be.
The problem is, when describing different cultures, that doesn't always fit.
Because approaches to an understanding of gender differs from culture to culture.
We're discussing multiple cultures in this video.
And we've mostly used the term gender diverse.
But it's important to recognise other gender diverse people of colour might use different terms altogether.
And that needs to be respected.
Nobody has the right to speak on behalf of anybody else.
Everyone gets to describe their own identity on their terms.
It's also important not to talk down to trans people of colour.
Even the most well-meaning allies have sometimes said things like,
They them pronouns are just too complicated.
Or trans people of color have a more basic understanding.
Assuming that gender diverse people of colour are ignorant or can't understand our own identities is actually a form of racism.
Don't assume that people can't understand the term you use.
But do show patience if the language you use is new to others.
That doesn't mean assuming it's all too hard for us by default.
it means using the language that you're comfortable with.
And explaining if somebody asks you to.
It's true that everyone has different approaches, experience, or access to information. So it's okay to pause and take a moment to explain, just don't shut down the dialogue entirely.
Of course, cultural differences of gender and transness go beyond the language used to describe them.
Understanding that a person's gender will differ from your own
will help you be more open to diverse experiences and stories.
rather than assuming we're all the same.
Coming out can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. As a Mexican non-binary person, questioning traditional notions of masculinity was part of my coming out experience. Reconciling my cultural identity with my gender identity has significantly taken a lot more work than just coming out in terms of my gender identity. But I found very little space to have these conversations, both within the trans community and the Mexican community. For me, coming out never came down to a single moment where I said it out loud. Many of us come out in silence, in actions rather than words. For example, the cover on my phone has a rainbow at the back. Of course, I know my father is well aware of its meaning, but he's never commented on it. That doesn't mean I'm closeted or ashamed. Quite the opposite, being trans has been a wonderful source of self-love. I'm just discovering how to come out on my own terms, how to celebrate my queerness in my own culture. Sometimes the best way is silent validation. It's really important to respect people's choices on how, when, and if they decide to come out, and not try to push anyone to doing it your way.
When you're trans and a person of colour, racism and transphobia can intersect in unique ways.
A lot of the beauty standards we're held to are very white-centric.
Trans and gender diverse people of colour feel like we need to work even harder for acceptance.
This applies even more to other intersections like
Disabled people, trans women, non-binary people,
Or people who don't have the funds or ability to access cosmetic products and services.
Passing based on other people's expectations isn't something that any trans person should have to do.
Obviously, how a person looks should not be a factor.
In whether or not their gender is respected.
Unfortunately, we know that as a society, the way we're treated or whether or not we're respected can be based heavily on appearances.
Another thing that can be tough is finding role models.
Finding role models to look up to can be tricky when you're part of a minority. So when we're both trans and a person of colour, our options can feel pretty limited.
but trying to increase representations for trans and gender diverse people of colour.
In books, in media, in sports, and in public life in general.
All help trans people of colour realise we're not alone and that we have a community.
Sometimes we'll get caught in the middle of other arguments.
Certain people will accuse certain cultures or religions of being transphobic.
Yet those same people can be pretty transphobic themselves.
So we end up just being used as a cover for racism.
Being made to feel like someone's ammunition in an argument never feels great.
And it can actually lead to confusion or spread misinformation. So rather than relying on what people outside our communities say about us, listen to gender diverse people of colour, because we're the experts on our lived experience.
So there you have it.
Being a good ally starts with giving trans people of colour our own platform.
Hearing what we have to say and amplifying our voices.
And by watching this video, you're already starting to do that.
If you find this video helpful, share it online to impact even more people.
And if you want to know more, check out the rest of Trans 101.
Full of even more awesome info about gender diversity.